What's up, folks? Scotty here, Blacklist Games, and I'm here today to show you how to play Hour of Need. First, however, let's set it up. First things first, each player has to choose a hero to play as. So I'm going to play as Majesty today in my single-player game. So what I need to do is go into the box and find her miniature. And I also need to find her deck. In her deck, I will pull out her double-sided hero card. Make sure that the focus side is face down, and I'm going to play that in front of me somewhere. The rest of her deck is shuffled and is placed to the left of her hero card. Make sure to leave some room to the left there for a discard pile. Now, throughout the game, this will be my hero play area, stretching out from the left here to the right. So I'll be playing some cards here. These will be my cards in my hero play area. Right above that, I need to leave some room for a threat area. So, I'll just lower this just a bit. If it's your first few games, I highly recommend pulling out a round structure reminder card. So this is just a handy-dandy reference card that tells you how the game works, essentially. So hand those out to new players or to yourself if it's your first time playing, and keep that nearby. Also, each hero needs 2 action tokens, and they should place those nearby as well. Then draw 4 cards to create your starting hand. Alright, hero setup is done. What's next? Issue setup. I'm going to choose Century Heist today as the issue that I'm going to play. So I find the board and I place it on the table so that all players have access to it. Then I find the corresponding issue deck in the box. And the first thing you need to do is pull out the 4 double-sided scheme cards. You're going to shuffle those up and you're going to hand one out randomly to each hero in play. Today it's a single-player game, so only one of us gets one. So I'm going to pull this one out here. So that's the Century Bank Hostages Scheme. This has the threat icon right over here, a little skull. So a threat card, when it's drawn, is placed in your threat area. So once again, each hero at the start of the game should receive one of these schemes, scheme side up. Any remaining scheme cards go back in the box because they won't be used this game. Then we go back into the deck and we pull out the issue overview card. Now this is going to basically have some setup instructions, but generally what happens is the issue overview card is the first card that is placed somewhere around the board so all players have access to it. And it will begin the creation of the issue play area. So this setup here says I have to find the vault card in the deck. So, here it is. And I have to place it sealed side up. There's 2 sides. I got opened and sealed. There you go, sealed side up. Any cards that are referenced in the setup rules always go to the right of the overview card. So I'm going to do this like this. And then the remaining issue cards are shuffled and they are placed to the left of the overview card. So just like the hero play area, the issue play area extends from left to right from the issue deck. Now you should also have room for a discard pile if you can for the issue deck. I like to put mine above it and perpendicular when they're discarded. That way they're easier to tell apart. But you can do it however you like. Now that we have an issue set up, we're going to take our hero miniatures and we're going to place them on or adjacent to the hero start space. So single player game, make it easy for myself. Majesty will start on the hero start space. Then we're going to find 4 bystander tokens to populate the 4 bystander spaces in every issue. Next, we have to choose a villain to go up against. So for today's game, I am choosing Dowager. So you go through her deck. First thing you do is you pull out the double-sided villain card. Make sure it's scheming side up, and we're going to create a villain play area, just like we have for the issue and the hero. That card is going to go here. The next thing you need to do is place a hidden token on the villain card right above the solve value here. 1 for each hero in play. So there's only 1 hero in play today, therefore 1 hidden token. Then we're going to go through the villain deck again, and we're going to pull out any cards that match my player count. So we're going to look for the scaling value here. So in a 1-player game, we're removing all the cards that say 1. If you were in a 5 or 6-player game, there are also some cards that have that scaling in there. But since I'm not, I don't have to worry about it. And we're going to take the remainder of this villain deck. We're going to shuffle it. Try not to break any cards. And we're going to place it to the left of the villain card. And this creates the villain play area. Now, there are some villains that have special setup rules. Dowager does not, so we don't have to worry about that. But if you do have a villain with setup rules, make sure to follow those. Next, we're going to find the villain miniature, and we're going to place it in the scheme panel 1, which is, well, has the big number 1 on it. Then we're also going to find the 4 lackey miniatures that correspond to the villain in question, and we're going to place them near the board in case they spawn during the game. If you're not sure which lackeys go with which villain, you can always just dig through the deck. You can find which one is Dowager's lackey, which is the Stooge. And in the instruction manual, you'll also see what the minis look like for Stooges and so on and so forth. Then make sure that the clue cards are shuffled and they are placed nearby so that all players have access to them. We'll just put that there for now. And lastly, take the handy dandy token tray out of the box and put it in the play area so all players have access to it. So you have all your tokens in there. Oh, we have the dice as well. Those are important to take out probably, so we'll be using those more often. But everything else is in here. Your damage tokens, your justice tokens, your minions, your bystanders, your focus, and your issue tokens. So keep those nearby. I'll just keep them off camera. And the last step of setup that I recommend if it's your first time playing an issue is to go through the included issue guide. There you'll find some special rules and clarifications that might be helpful for your first time playing. And of course, we also have a narrative that you can follow along in order to really set the stage and jump into the story. And with that, we are ready to play. So in Hour of Need, you as the heroes are attempting to stop the villain from accomplishing their goal and escaping justice. So to win, we need to take out the villain. The only way to do that is to knock them out, deal damage to them equal to their health value. At the start of the game, you won't know what that is. I mean, you can always take a sneak peek. It's on the other side of the villain card, but how you get to reveal that, well, we'll find out in the actual rules. But for now, keep in mind that, yeah, you have to defeat the villain to win. To lose, well, there are generally 2 conditions. One is common to all the issues, which is if you have to draw a card from the issue deck at the end of the round and you cannot because there are none left, it's game over. You took too long, the villain has escaped. Otherwise, each issue has their own unique loss conditions. Generally, you'll know from the overview card what that is. Some issues might only reveal the loss conditions later on as you play, but generally, you'll have an idea. So for example here, the Century Heist says that if the villain ever escapes with the gold, you lose. So what does that mean? You'll find out when you play. Alright, so each round in Hour of Need is broken down into 3 turns. There is the villain turn, the hero turn, and the issue turn. So during the villain turn, each hero will draw 1 card in the order of their choosing from this deck, and then resolve it. So let's take a look at the different kinds of cards you can get from a villain deck. Now generally, there are lackeys. So if you get a lackey, it's a threat card, so it's going to go into your threat area, and then you're going to spawn the colored, the matching colored lackey on the matching colored scheme space, which is one of these here. So, for example, if I drew this green lackey, he would go onto the screen space like so. You might also draw a peril card, which is also a threat card. It would go into your threat area like so. And the peril card matches one of the 4 peril spaces, which is the exclamation marks here. They're all in the 4 different colors. If you get the green one, like I just did, you get the green peril token and you place it on the green peril space. Now some of these might do things immediately. Otherwise, some of these might just be like ticking time bombs, quite literally as well. So their activated effects will tell you how they work. So you might want to solve those quickly before they get out of hand. Most of the cards, however, are these ploy cards. Ploy cards are quite simple. They will have a series of icons. You must resolve them from left to right, and your game round reference card will tell you what they do. But just for the sake of this video, let me go through them here. So if you get a colored shape here, it pretty much means you have to place a minion in that corresponding scheme panel. So for example here, if I have the green scheme panel listed, I would place a minion in the green scheme panel like so. The globe icon means that the villain will inflict or scheme. If you have an or word there, it means you can choose. The player chooses what they do. However, they must be able to do it. I'll get back to that in a few seconds. Next we have the bystander icon. This one's quite straightforward. You either place a bystander on the map in a non-occupied bystander space, or the villain will capture a bystander. So at the start of the game, this is very bad because all 4 bystander spaces are occupied, so I cannot place a bystander on the map. Therefore, I must do the other choice, which is the villain captures a bystander. So when the villain captures a bystander, it's quite straightforward. You take a bystander token from the supply, and you place it in the scheme panel closest to the villain. The villain is in the red scheme panel, therefore it is captured there. Now, there is another icon that can happen on these ploy cards, which is this special, and that's pretty much resolving the special text that is listed on the card. So you just read what those say. You'll also notice some of them that say Showdown. You can ignore this text until the Showdown phase of the game, which we'll get to later. But going back to the villain inflicting or scheming, what does that mean? So if the villain schemes, you'll simply read the scheme effect on the scheme panel that they are closest to, and that'll tell you what they do. And that's generally going to advance their goal, by the way. So you want the villain to scheme as little as possible. And then inflicts. So the villain inflicts, that basically means they deal damage. So each villain will have a damage output, so represented by this yellow, well, their inflict value, essentially. So she does 1 damage while she's scheming, mind you. When she comes out to play on her Showdown side, she inflicts for a lot more. But yeah, so you would inflict a hero for 1 damage. The thing is, whenever there's the word inflict on an effect, it'll usually say something like inflicts all the heroes, or inflicts within 3 spaces, or something like that. If it doesn't specify a range or a target, and it just says the villain inflicts, the stipulation there is that the target must be nearby. Nearby in this game means in the same space or adjacent to. So if the villain cannot inflict a nearby hero, therefore it would just not inflict. And if it cannot inflict, then it must scheme. You have to choose one that she can perform. But that's essentially the villain turn. So you just resolve icons from left to right, or you place a new threat card in your threat area, and you're done. Alright, so now it is time for the hero turn. This is where all the heroes will play simultaneously, and all the action happens. So there's a lot to go over. I'll do my best to break it down into digestible chunks so you can follow along at home. The first thing that happens during the hero turn is all the heroes ready their exhausted cards. So in this example here, I had 2 exhausted cards, so I would simply ready them. And of course, you also refresh your action tokens to make sure they are available to be used during this hero turn. So, unlike a lot of other games where each hero has their own hero turn, this game has a hero turn for all the heroes, which means everyone can act essentially at the same time. The only stipulation is that if someone is performing an action, that action must be fully resolved before moving on to someone else's action or any other game effect. Okay, let's break down these actions to see what we can do. Well, firstly, each hero will have different cards in play during the game, and some of these cards will have unique actions. You can tell something costs an action, which, by the way, whenever you perform an action, you flip this down to its exhausted side. Anything that costs an action is essentially going to be represented by an action symbol. So Majesty here has a unique action she can perform, so that's something to keep in mind. And each hero will have unique actions and stuff like that that appear throughout the game thanks to their cards. But there are also 5 common actions that all the heroes can perform, so let's go through those together and see what they do. So, for one of my actions, I could draw a card. That one's pretty straightforward. Draw a card from your deck, add it to your hand. Put that back here. For another action, I can play an action card. So what is playing an action card? You're going to have a hand of cards during the game, and some of these will have the action symbol on the bottom right. Some of them will not. The ones that do, the only way to play those is to actually spend one of your actions to play it out. Now, the cards that do not have an action symbol, such as this one, they can be played at any time during the hero turn. So, again, before or after someone does an action, essentially. There are 2 different kinds of cards. So, instants, regardless of if they cost an action or not, when they're played, they are discarded after their effect is performed. So, they're one and dones. So, you play it, You do it instantly, and then you discard it. A constant card, on the other hand, is played down and remains in play, thus the name constant. It's played into your hero play area down here, and into the rightmost available space, and it's just going to give you some sort of buff or extra abilities during the game. So, for example, here the Power of Positivity for Majesty gives her an additional die when she attacks, which is pretty cool. One thing that's important to note before I forget, some of these cards will have a little arrowhead next to the name. That is essentially indicating it is a unique card. So if ever you have a copy of that card already in play and you want to play a second one, you actually have to discard the first one and then replace it with the new one. And while we're on the subject of cards, I'm probably going to forget this otherwise. Let's talk about those now. Here we go. You'll notice some of these have these blue heroic feat icons. There are 4 different heroic feats in the game. So basically how those work, if you have those in your hand at any point during the game, you can discard it from hand, ignoring the rest of the card's effects, and just say, I'm performing the heroic feat on this card, and you discard it, and you perform the heroic feat. So what are the heroic feats? Well, we'll learn what attacks and solving is later, but essentially the attack one gives you a free attack action, which is pretty cool. Doesn't cost one of your actions. The mobility one lets you go to any space on the board, so that is super powerful. The solve one gives you a free solve action, which again does not cost one of your actions. And the defensive one lets you play this when you're being attacked, and essentially if ever you have damage incoming, you can ignore up to 3 of that damage. So that's very powerful as well. Okay, so I think that's covered everything regarding your player cards. So just to recap, since I sort of went off on a tangent there, for one action, you can draw a card. For another action, you can play an action card from your hand. And again, these actions, you can repeat them on your turn. So both your actions on your turn can be the same action if you want. There's no limit to that. Now, let's get into movement. So movement is going to involve me explaining how the board works. So let's get into that. Each issue board represents a map of some sort of location. Sometimes it'll be very zoomed out, like a city here. Sometimes it'll be very zoomed in, like a library or a secret lab or something like that. Either way, every map is broken down into hexes, and a move action lets you move 3 hexes. So sorry, let's put Majesty back here. I moved it from the board earlier. So you move 3 spaces, so for one action, so let's do that. 1, 2, 3. Simple as that. Now there are other spaces that I should probably mention on this board so you understand how it works. I did talk about peril spaces earlier, so that's where you would place perils that come into play. There are the bystander spaces, which I mentioned also. Any bystander tokens would go there if they're unoccupied. Some issues might also have issue-specific spaces that are unique to that board. That would be covered on the issue overview card. Century Heist has none of those. Now, the most important spaces that are common to all the issues are the scheme spaces, which are the colored shapes, and their corresponding scheme panels. Now, before I get into what a scheme panel and a scheme space is, I want to point out a couple of other things on the map. If there is an enemy figure on the map, you cannot enter its space. You have to go around it. So if I was here, for example, and I wanted to move 3, I'd have to go 1, 2, 3. I can't go through this enemy. Same thing for him, by the way. Also, if at any point I enter a bystander space through my move, so 1, 2, 3, I actually save that bystander, which is great. I remove it from the board and I put it back in the supply. And for saving a bystander, I get a clue. I'll talk about clues more in a bit. Alright, so scheme panels, scheme spaces, what are they and how do they relate to each other? Well, basically, they are the same space. The scheme panel is just a sort of blown-up version of that space. So anything in either of those 2 spaces are at the same place, and they're considered in the same space. Now, there's a couple of reasons why we split these up. Firstly, the scheme panel, which represents this scheme space, for example, here, might eventually get a whole bunch of tokens added to it, because a bunch of stuff is going down in that space. So this allows us to have a lot of components in the same space. Secondly, these sort of ignore that rule I mentioned earlier where you cannot enter a space occupied by an enemy figure. Scheme spaces, scheme panels, they ignore that rule. So if I had a movement of 3 with Majesty here, I would go 1, 2, and I can still enter the scheme space. But as a hero, I am never placed in a scheme space. That's reserved for bad guys, essentially. So I'm automatically teleported to the corresponding scheme panel. Here I am now with 2 minions, a bystander, the villain, and a lackey, and we are all considered part of the same scheme space. We're just placed in the scheme panel. So heroes will always be in scheme panels because, again, they're just part of that specific rule, so it lets them enter a location. Lackeys will never enter scheme panels. They'll just stay on the map because they're just walking around causing havoc. The villain will begin the game bouncing around from scheme panel to scheme panel, but eventually during the showdown phase, they will then be placed on the map to become essentially a lackey, an enemy on the board, and then they will bounce from scheme space to scheme space. So the way to know if it's showdown time or not is if the villain is in a scheme panel or actually on a scheme space. Oh, and there's minions. Minions in general, they'll always be in the scheme panels, not the scheme spaces, but they're these special tokens that go there. Right, so now that we understand scheme panels and scheme spaces, we can move on to the last 2 common actions that are available to all the heroes, which are attacking and solving. So let's see what attacking and solving is, what the differences are. For both, you're going to take a look at your hero card, and you're going to choose either the attack value, which is the yellow bubble, or the solve value, which is the pink thought bubble. You're going to take a look at the value here, and you're going to roll that many dice for that action. So Majesty is pretty easy for either attacking or solving. She'll roll 2 dice. You'll roll those dice, and you'll apply those successes as either damage for an attack or as justice when you're solving. So let's take a look at dice rolling first, how that works. This is a success, so that's 1 damage or 1 justice, if you get that. This is a burst, which is, there's only one face that has it, so 1 in 6 chance to get this. It counts as a success, which is great, so a damage or a justice, but you immediately get to roll another die and get those results as well. So if I had a single die in my roll and I get a burst, well, I actually get an additional die, and if I roll a burst there, I can roll an additional die. So if I end up with this at the end of all of that, I would actually have 3 successes, right? Because the bursts count as a success, and here's a success here. So 3 successes, that would be 3 damage or 3 justice, depending on which of the actions I'm doing. And lastly, there is the focus symbol. If you get this during a roll, you've got a choice to make. You can either spend a focus you have on your character card, put it back in the supply, and therefore this focus is converted to a success, or alternatively, you can choose to take a focus from the supply and add it to your character card. Your character card can never have more than 5 focus. That is the limit for each hero. Now, if you ever have 5 focus on a card, I would spend all 5 of those, and I can choose to flip to my focused side. So that's how you become focused. And then you have this new beefed up version of your hero. And the only way to go back to your non-focused side is usually to perform the special ability on it. So for example, if I take a look here, Majesty has a health value of 15, which is how much damage she can take, an attack value of 2, and a solve value of 2, and a ability called Gift from Above. If I choose to spend 5 focus, I spend those, and I flip to my focus side. Her health value remains the same, but you'll notice that she's much more focused on attacking now, so it's a 3 value. Her solve becomes 1, so don't flip to your focus side if you're planning on doing a lot of solving with Majesty, at least. And then her ability becomes a new one called Unified Assault, and then at the end of it, it says, do it all, and then flip this card. So that's how that works. Alright, so what do you attack and what do you solve? Well, you attack enemies. In the game, there are generally 3 kinds of enemies. There's the villain, who you cannot attack at the start of the game because they are scheming and they're essentially hidden. So when they're in the scheme panel here, we as players know that she's in the abandoned warehouse, but the heroes do not. She's hidden, she's hiding, and we have to find her. So, you know, we know there's these people here, but she's in the shadows, in the rafters, in a secret panel, I don't know, whatever you want to say. And she can still inflict damage on you, though. We'll get to that when we talk about solving. So like I said, you can attack the villain if they're available to be attacked. There are minions. So these minions have 1 health apiece, and they deal 1 damage apiece as well. So they're pretty easy to get rid of. And then there's the lackeys who will appear on the board to wreak havoc, and they have their own unique values, which are over here. So a stooge in this case has a health value of 8. Let me bring this closer. Has a health value of 8, has a defense of 0, and has an inflict value of 2. Their defense essentially is the damage you have to get past in order to actually do damage. So if they had a defense of 1, for example, and they had 2 successes, one of the successes would be canceled, and only 1 would remain to do damage. But in this case, he has a defense of 0, so all the damage goes through, so that's pretty good. So those are the targets that you can attack. So you would choose a space. So let's say Majesty is here in the scheme panel for the abandoned warehouse, and she wants to attack. So her valid targets are these 2 minions. The villain cannot be attacked at this point in the game, so these are my only 2 choices. I would roll my 2 dice for my attack value here, do this, and there we go. So I rolled this, which is 2 successes and a focus symbol. So I don't have any focus, so I can't convert to an extra success, so I'll just take that here as a token. So the target space, wherever you're doing the attack, you can distribute the damage as you'd like amongst any valid targets. So I have 2 damage, and there's 2 valid targets here. Well, I'm going to do 1 damage apiece, and that just happens to be enough to get rid of each. And there you go. If there were other enemies, like the lackey here, for example, in this red space, that would be the same space as that. So I would also be able to say instead, let's put these 2 minions back here. I have 2 damage. Well, I'll do 1 damage to this minion, and I'll do 1 damage to this stooge, who happens to be in the same space. Whenever you defeat an enemy card, you get to draw a clue card, just like saving a bystander. So I say enemy card because minions don't have cards to represent them, therefore you do not get a clue when you defeat them. They're just removed from the board, but proper lackeys will give you a clue card when you defeat them. Okay, so how does solving work? Solving, again, very similar to attacking, but instead you are solving a problem card. So a problem card is anything that has a solve value in a pink bubble. So for example, this scheme here is a problem card. If I'm near a map-based problem, I can be in or adjacent to it, essentially. I can do the solving there. So I could do my solve action, 2 dice. Oh, I got a burst and a success, and a focus. So I could say I'm going to spend the focus on this one. Therefore, 3 successes. That would be 3 justice placed on the Widowmaker, and then I'd have to attempt more solve actions to try to bust that. Whenever you solve a problem card, you get a clue. So let me put a clue here, and I'll tell you what they do in a few seconds here. But otherwise, if it's something that's based in a scheme panel, such as the hostages scheme here, you must be in the scheme panel to do it. And then you attempt a solve, so same thing. I roll my 2 dice because I have a solve value of 2 with Majesty, for example. I got 1 success and 2 focus, so I would put 1 justice on the problem card here, and I would get 2 focus from my results because I don't have any tokens to spend there. But if I had them, I could have converted them, as I explained earlier. Solving is interesting because while you're focusing on a problem, you're not focusing on bad guys, right? Let's say we had this set up right here, okay? And I wanted to try to solve my hostage scheme over here. I have to try to figure out what's going on. As Majesty, I'm going to, say I declare an action to solve. I will do my solve value of 2 dice. All right, cool. I got 2 successes. Therefore, I get to put 2 justice on any valid problem in that space. So if there are other problems in the scheme panel, I would be able to distribute this justice among them, sort of like multiple targets in an attack. But for now, I'll just say I'll put both on this. Once the solve action is resolved, any nearby enemies will immediately inflict their damage upon me. So right now I have a problem because I just did this and I totally ignored all the bad guys around me. So there's a minion, the villain, which is still hidden in the shadows, and a lackey who is on the map, but he is in the same space, because remember, a scheme space and scheme panel represent the same thing. So right now, I will be inflicted for 1 damage from this minion, 1 damage from this minion. The villain in the shadows still inflicts me for a value of 1, as per her card. And this lackey here, whose card I got rid of, let's just say here he is, the Stooge, he would inflict me for a value of 2. So that's 1, and 1, and 1, and 2, for a total of 5 damage that I take because I was ignoring bad guys and I was instead focusing on a problem. So that's why you might want to beat up some bad guys before you solve some problems. But of course, every hero will have tricks up their sleeves with their cards that will allow them to do crazy things like attack from a distance or solve from a distance. And that will let you ignore nearby enemies and their inflict values. Now, after all that is said and done, let's talk about these clues. So these clues, as a reminder, you get them every time you save a bystander, every time you defeat an enemy card, and every time you solve a problem card. Okay? So if I got this clue earlier on, for example, you'll see it's called Shared Intel. Each clue will have 2 different things you can do with it. The first thing is sacrificing it at any time you want to roll some dice to add dice to that roll. So if I was doing a solve or an attack with Majesty with 2 dice, I could say I'm sacrificing my Shared Intel clue, discard it, and I get 2 additional dice because that's how many extra dice it gives. If I had multiple clues saved up, by the way, I could spend all of them on 1 dice roll and add that many dice. This is a super crazy, exaggerated example, but just to show you that there's no limit to how many dice you can add to a die roll via clue cards you discard at that time. The other thing clue cards can do is they each have a text ability, and you can discard this card at any time to perform it. So for example, this one says, choose a hero to gain 2 focus. There you go. So you save up your clue cards from doing all that for a rainy day for when you really need them, and each one will give you 2 options on how to use them. Alright, so that is all of the actions a hero can do. The moment a hero has performed 2 actions, you pause the game regardless of if any other heroes have done their 2 actions or not. This hero has done 2 actions, the game is paused, and their threat phase kicks in. The threat phase is pretty easy. You look at their threat area, and you trigger all the activate effects on all these threat cards from left to right. So for example here, I have the Hostages card first, which says activate, move a bystander from the map to Century Bank. Okay, so he's been captured there. By the way, any captured bystanders in a scheme panel are considered part of a problem, so you would solve to try to get to save these. So let's say I was trying to, solve my scheme over here while I'm there, and if I happen to have an extra success, or I want to use one of my successes to save this guy, I can totally do that. So I would have 2 successes, for example. I could add a justice here and remove this guy for 1 and save him. And remember, every time you save one, regardless of where they are, you get a clue card. But yeah, so that's, let's say I did this activate effect here, and move on to the Stooge, and these guys would be on the board somewhere. So this guy would activate, he would move 3 and inflict. So he moves 3 towards either the closest bystander or the closest hero, whichever one is closest, really. Clearly this guy is in the same space as a hero, so he's not even going to move, and he's just going to inflict for his value of 2, therefore Majesty takes 2 damage. And this lackey here, he would move 3 towards the closest hero or the bystander. Closest hero is Majesty, who is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spaces away. The closest bystander is 1, 2, 3, 4. Clearly this is the closest one, so he's going to go 1, 2, 3. He doesn't get to capture this bystander yet, though he has to be in the same space. So that's ignored. And the Widowmaker here, which is still in play, for example, would activate, which says if there's a bystander on this card, defeat it and discard the card. But there's none, so otherwise move a bystander from play or the supply to this card. So I would take this and do this, and then the next time this bystander would be defeated if I haven't solved this peril. When a bystander is defeated, this is very important, it's removed from the game supply. So there's a finite supply of bystanders, I don't remember exactly how many, but when someone is defeated, they go back in the box, not the supply. So you have less and less bystanders to come out. And that's important because crises can occur if there aren't enough bystanders to come out. And I'll explain what a crisis is shortly. But yeah, so once you're done with all the activations, the hero turn resumes, allowing all the heroes to do more actions if they have any. But keep in mind that your free cards can still be played at this time, even if you're done with your actions. So that's pretty cool, as long as there are other heroes in play, of course. If all the heroes have done their threat phase, the hero turn ends immediately, and you can't play more free cards. So make sure to get those free cards in before the final threat phase of the hero turn occurs. But when all the threat phases are done, the heroes each draw a card and add it to their hand. Okay, and to end the round, we do the issue turn, which is the entire group drawing a single issue card and resolving it. So here, this one says, reporting live. If Gabby Woods is in play, she's captured, but she's not in play currently, so otherwise the villain schemes. So when the villain schemes, like I said earlier, they will simply resolve the scheme effect of the scheme panel they are closest to. So if for some reason she was on the board during the showdown phase, she would still get the scheme with the yellow effect because she's closest to the yellow space. Now remember, villain scheming is bad, and this is discarded by the way, and villain scheming is bad because it advances their plot and therefore gets them closer to victory. Once the issue turn is done, we flip this over and a new round begins with a new villain turn in which all the heroes will resolve a villain card. And it goes on just like that until you either win or you lose. Now let's talk about specific moments in the game that can occur. Alright, so something that can occur in the game is a hero being defeated. So if ever, let's say Majesty here, somehow gets into a fight and she somehow gets damage equal to her health value, she's defeated. What happens when you're defeated is you clear all the damage, you lose all your focus. If you were on your focus side, you no longer are. Let me put that back there. Your character is removed from the board and a crisis occurs. Now, crises are bad. They will advance the plot quickly. So you don't want those to happen. Therefore, you don't want to be defeated too often. But you're a hero, so being defeated doesn't mean it's the end of the game. At the end of the turn in which you were defeated, you place your hero miniature back either in the hero start space or adjacent to it, just like at the beginning of the game, basically. Now, keep in mind that if your defeat occurs during the hero turn, you lose all remaining actions and then you're removed from the board as usual, but your threat phase occurs immediately. Okay, so I've been talking about crises a lot. What are crises? Essentially, anytime a component has to be added to the board, but there aren't enough in the supply, a crisis will occur. So if there's too many minions on the board and we don't have any left in the supply, a crisis will occur. If we have to place a bystander somewhere on the board and there are none left in the supply, a crisis occurs, so on and so forth. And a crisis is essentially resolving all the crisis effects that are currently in play. Oops. Some of them are not too bad, but as the game progresses, they get worse. More components will appear with more crisis effects in play. And whenever a crisis occurs, all the crisis effects have to be triggered from left to right. And that's bad because that will accelerate the villain's plot. Alright, so now let's take a look at how you actually win the game by defeating the villain. So the moment a scheme card has justice on it equal to its solve value, that means the problem itself is solved. So the icon here tells you it is now time to remove a hidden token from the villain card. So in this one-player game, that would remove this single hidden token. And now we can see that the villain now has a solve value. So let's put that back down for a second here. So this scheme card, you'd remove the justice, and now it is time to flip it over to its complication side. And you would replace it as now, for example, they're all different. This one happens to be a threat, so it would go back to my threat area. And when you do solve the problem, you do get a clue card as normal. Then it flips over. This becomes a new threat in this case. So I'll just hide this so you don't see what it is, so you don't spoil your game. So now that we actually have a solve value available for the villain, it means we can actually try to use solve actions to apply justice to this card. So this little icon here means per player. So in this one-player game, I would need 5 justice on this card in order to advance. So what happens here is we manage to, let's say throughout the game, put 5 justice on this card. I would solve this problem. I would get a clue for solving a problem. And now the villain goes into showdown mode. So this becomes a threat card. Whoever solved it gets it as a threat. Now, what happens when the villain enters showdown mode, they leave the scheme panel and enter the scheme space that represents it. If it's occupied, just place them next to it. So you'll see here that the villain now has a health value, so we have to deal that much damage to it. In this case, 15 per player, per hero, sorry, in order to defeat them, and that's how you win the game. They have their stats here. They have a new activate ability that will activate each threat phase. So the last thing to mention is showdown mode now includes an extra step when you're resolving an attack that involves the villain. So you'll do the same thing. You'll declare a space as a target. You'll roll your attack value. However, before you resolve any possible focus and continue the resolution that way, you'll draw the top card of the villain deck and you'll flip it over. If there's a showdown effect, you have to resolve the entire showdown effect first and then continue with the resolution of the attack, converting focus or getting focus, applying the damage, so on and so forth. And that's pretty much it. So if you're able to apply that 15 damage in this case, or 30 in a two-player game, so on and so forth, you win the game. The heroes are victorious and the villain has been defeated. Otherwise, you keep going until either you run out of cards in the, or you can't draw a card from the issue deck, or the villain's plot or goal is achieved and you lose that way. Now, of course, there are other edge cases and really specific rules for very specific situations. I won't go into those, but you can read all about those in the rule book. But otherwise, yeah, that's it. That's everything you need to know to jump into your first game of Hour of Need, and hope you guys have fun with it. Stay tuned to the channel. We'll have some playthroughs coming soon. Until then, I'm Scotty. Keep playing those Blacklist games.